Okay, today's Daf we're going to learn is Yevamot Daf Kaf Gimel. I just want to mention before we start that our hearts go out to the families from the Pigua yesterday and from earlier in the week, and our thoughts are with them. We can dedicate our learning in their memory. Okay, we're going to get started from the bottom of yesterday's Daf, even from the midpoint of the Daf of the midpoint of yesterday's Amud Bet. I just want to do a quick review from there. Tanu Rabbanan. Okay, I'm not going to read through. I'm just going to remind you of this basic machloka between Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda and the rabbis. So Rabbi Abal Achoto v'hi bat eshet aviv. Okay, it sounds like a very confusing case. I'll just explain it very clearly. Somebody has relations with his sister, who not only do they share the same father, but it's a half sister. But the sister is married. It could be a full sister, by the way, but the sister is from a marriage between the father and another woman, as opposed to if it was, let's say, out of wedlock, that he had a child. So basically, we have this situation where we have a man who has a relationship with a woman who is his sister through the father, and the father happens to be married to the woman who he had a child with. In that case, the rabbis say he's liable twice. Okay, now obviously if you're going to get karet, it's not twice, but things that are karet are basically, there's double, right? If it's karet, then there's both. If there's karet, that's by God, but you will get lashes by the court. So in that case, basically you're going to end up getting lashes and, right, double lashes, double set. Or if you did it unwittingly, you're going to do 2 korbanot chatat. So now you have this situation. That's what Rabbi Yossi says. Where does he learn it from? From the fact that besides the pasuk about achotcha, it also says, right, there's one that says your father's children. Then it says also ben eshet achiv, which means basically it's the son of your wife's, right, your father's wife. And that's what he understands. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, now we're going to jump down. We're not going to go through all the backs and forth this they did, but the now big question is, what is Rabbi Yossi Bri Rabbi Yehuda, who thinks you only get one? What does he do with that word? Bat eshet achicha. Why do you need to say that? Right? If you say there's an extra set of lashes, it's very clear why you say it. But if you don't say that, then what do you need this bat eshet achicha for? So that's what we're going to start right now. We're about 10 lines from the bottom of Kaf Bet Amud Bet. It says here, Rabbi Yossi Bri Rabbi Yehuda, Hi bat eshet achicha mai avid. So basically, we're going to have an answer, and then we're going to give 3 other suggestions that he could have said, and why didn't he say those? Okay, we're going to basically say, Bat Esh Davicha comes to exclude that it's not your sister in this case, if what? Okay, that's when it's your sister, someone your father's married to. If your father married even, or had some relationship and had a child with either a shifcha Knaanit, a Canaanite slave, or an Oveda Kochavim, a Gentile woman, then that sibling that you have from that relationship is not your sibling. Why is it not your sibling? Because there's no, here we get the word eshet from the language of ishut, marriage. There's no marriage between them. That's not considered a marriage. You can't marry, a Jewish man can't marry a Canaanite slave woman. So he could marry her in his eyes, but that's not Jewish marriage under Jewish law, which means that your sister that's born from that relationship is not actually your sister. It's not a rayot. It's not a forbidden relationship because we don't even consider that your sister. That's the main premise of all of today's, right? The first whole Amud Aleph of today's daf is this drasha basically and dealing with it, okay? So now, dealing with it, number 1, we're going to have to deal with why did he exclude that and not other cases where there's no ishut? Like, for example, right, the easiest, right, out of marriage, okay? We're going to get to, I see you're asking, it's not like a mamzer, so we're going to get to that, Tova. At the end of the daf, they're going to ask, is this a mamzer? It's not, okay, and we'll talk about that. But the main idea here is this is not considered your sister because it was born from your father. It wasn't eshet avicha. He might have called her eshet avicha, but she's not eshet avicha halachically. So now, the big thing is going to be, why don't we exclude other cases where there's not ishut? Ve'ema prala choto me'anusa. What if he had a child out of wedlock? Maybe the pasuk's coming to teach you that's also not your sister. So we can't say that. Why not? Hahi lo matzit amar. That really means we can't say that. Why not? Miderava. Because of Rava. And we actually have seen this before. De Rava Rami. Okay, we're going to have to kind of zoom out for a minute and understand what Rava brought a contradiction, and then we're going to have to connect it to us. The Gemara actually doesn't do the connecting thing. Sometimes they just kind of throw things out there and you have to figure out how it connects. So now Rava brings up two verses. Ktiv. So again, forget about right now about the sister. We're not talking about a sister. We're talking about erva regarding your daughter and granddaughter. Really granddaughter. Rami, he says Rami means contradiction. He throws two psukim up against each other. That's what Rami really means, to throw up against, which basically means to contradict. Ervat bat bincha o bat bitcha lo tegale. Okay, that says your granddaughter, either your son's daughter or your daughter's daughter, you can't sleep with your granddaughter. Ha bat binadida u bat bitadida shari. From that pasuk, it sounds like if it was your wife's granddaughter, right? You married a woman, she had a daughter already from a different marriage, and she has a granddaughter. It sounds like it would be okay. But there's another verse which seems to indicate not. Uktiv ervat isha ubita lo tegale. You can't sleep with a woman and her daughter, ve'et bat bina ve'et bat bita, nor her grandchildren. So the first pasuk seemed to say you could, because it was only saying yours. And this one seems to say your wives as well. So haketzad, how do you explain this? Kam ba'onsim, kam b'nisuin. The first pasuk was talking about outside of marriage, out of wedlock. If you had grandchildren, right? If you had a woman that you had a child with, but you weren't married to her, if you weren't married to her, her children are not, her grandchildren are not forbidden to you, nor her children. But if you had, obviously, your children you had in your relationship with her, obviously forbidden because they're your children. That's why it comes to say your children with her, but not other children that she had. The second verse that we quoted comes to say, if you're married to a woman, though, all of her children are forbidden to you. So now, what does this teach you? So this doesn't really, what does this teach you about sisters? Well, what it teaches you is, now here's a bit of a jump, but it's not a jump. It makes sense. It's just not really what the Gemara was saying directly. Since the first verse, which was saying your child, right, your grandchild is forbidden to you. And that meant that Rava determined that whole verse was talking about out of wedlock. So what's it telling you again? If you have children out of wedlock, you're not married to the woman that you had this relationship with, your children and your grandchildren are forbidden to you. Not your wife's children, but your children and your grandchildren. Now, the focus before was, why not your wife's? But now the focus is your children, though, that were born out of wedlock are forbidden to you, which means what? They're your children and they're your grandchildren, which means, now we want to know about siblings, which means if you have children out of wedlock, they're your full-fledged children, and their siblings are going to be siblings with each other. So if one was in a marriage and one was out of wedlock, it doesn't matter. They're still your children, in which case they're still siblings. So because Rava said that verse that was talking about ben bina, ben bino, ben bita, bat bincha, bat bitcha, was talking about out of wedlock, and they're your children and grandchildren, then obviously siblings are going to be siblings. And therefore, so again, what do we have? Bat esh davicha, we're going to keep going back to the beginning so we stay clear and on track. Bat esh davicha, according to Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, which didn't come for what the rabbi said it came to, which was to give an extra set of lashes or extra korban chatatz in offering if you did it unwittingly. Doesn't come for that. According to him, what does it come? To teach you that we're going to exclude the shifcha and the ovedet kochavim, right? A sibling that you have from your father's relationship with some non-Jewish woman is not considered your sister, but it would be if it was a sibling out of wedlock. Now, option number 2, why don't we exclude something else? What if it was someone that the father wasn't allowed to marry, like he marries a mamzer, or he's a Kohen and he marries a divorcee? That's chayve lavin. Why don't we say, well, there's no ishut there. Well, first of all, we know there is ishut there. Remember, we discussed this, and that's what we're going to see right now. And we'll finally find the source for this. Amara papa chayve lavin tafsibu kiddushin. What do you mean? If you marry someone you're not allowed to marry, there's only chayve lavim, not karet or mitapetin. But if it's chayve lavim, it's just a lo tase, which means you get lashes for it. You don't get a more severe punishment. Your kiddushin actually is valid. It's a valid kiddushin. So that's why Isha, right? It was, but Esha Ravicha is your sister. She's married to your father, even though she wasn't supposed to marry your father and he wasn't supposed to marry her. But the fact is the marriage is valid because we know that. Now, how do we know that? First of all, remember, Rabbi Akiva disagrees with this. But we don't hold that way. And that's where Rav Papa is siding with the other side. Dichtiv ki tiyena leish shtei nashim, ha'achat ahuva va'achat snua. This is a very interesting passage in the Torah where it talks about a situation where you have two wives. Okay, and then it says, and you have children from one and the other, and basically the bechor is the snua. You can't basically choose to make the elder from the one you love better. Okay, you have one wife you love, you have one wife you hate. Sounds a little bit similar, although it's strong to say the Yaakov hated Leah, but this idea about having two women, two wives, and there was one that was more favored over the other. And again, this case, same situation where the bechor was Leah, the one that was less preferred as opposed to Rachel, right? You can't switch the bechorim. But anyway, they're going to take this and learn something else entirely, which is, so the Gemara asks the following question. They're assuming, this is written in the Torah, and it seems to be not, right? Ahuva and snua, usually we think of very subjective, right? They're, like if I read that verse, I would say the husband preferred one over the other, right? He loved one, he didn't love the other. But the way they read it is, the Torah is saying there's a situation where there's a loved one and a not loved one objectively. So they say, there's no thing that God, right? If the Torah is God-given, so God then is going to say, there's one that I love and there's one I don't love. Like what? There's no such thing as God loving one wife and not loving another wife, or even just saying there's no objective. Right? This sounds like there's an objective thing where one is loved and one is not loved. Well, one is hated. What does that mean? So they say, Ela ahuva ahuva b'nisueha. Snua b'nisueha. It must be referring to two women. One is beloved because her marriage was a valid one. And one is hated because hated by God. That means God is very upset about this relationship because it was a forbidden relationship. And then we're going to say, let's say it was a Kohen and a divorcee or something. And then notice what it says in the Torah, though. First of all, it treats them as if they're married because it says, don't choose this bechor over the other, this firstborn. And it says, Va'amarachmana ki tiyena. Not only that, but there's this Hashon, ki tiyena leish shtei nashim. There's havaya. Havaya is always a term they use, like being, which is a term for marriage, which means you're married to them. So you might have done something incorrect, but you're still married to them. It's still a valid marriage. So there we have, you can't say that Eshet comes to exclude chayve lavim, someone who married someone they're not supposed to marry, because chayve lavim, there's actual kiddushin. You're obviously married to them. If you're obviously married to them, then obviously your children are your children, right? And they're siblings with each other. And Ish, which would determine, which is to exclude someone where there is no marriage, well, it can't exclude them because there is marriage. Next option number 3, and this is the last option, although it'll be quite long. Now we get to the obvious question, which is, well, karet, let's say a man sleeps with his daughter and has children, they won't be, maybe we would say, those children, since the forbidden marriage, karet, and we say, in Kiddushin Tovsim, in Chayve Kritut. There's no marriage there. So maybe the children born from that marriage won't be full-fledged siblings for arayot purposes, for forbidden relationships, with a brother born from a regular marriage that father had. So, Amar Rava, Amar Kra, Ervat achotcha v'tavicha o batimecha moledet bayit o moledet chutz. We're going to quote a different pasuk, which is going to basically, the other pasuk about your sister, the daughter of your father or the daughter of your mother. We saw this yesterday, right? And then we said, theoretically, you can make a kavachomer, right? But we don't make kavachomers like this. What if it's your full sister? That's not what's going to interest us right now. What we're basically going to have is the bat ish davicha limits it, that there has to be ishut, marriage, and this doesn't have marriage. But this other pasuk includes. That pasuk was limiting. This pasuk is including. And this pasuk is going to include chayve kritut. How do we know that? Because it has some strange words, the continuation of that verse. Moledet bayit o moledet chutz. I'm not even sure exactly how to translate it, but born from the house or born from outside. Okay, so what does it mean, born from the house or born from outside? Ben she'omrim lo lavicha kayem, ben she'omrim lo lavicha hotzei. Whether you tell your father, right, in our house, this is always the term used, she's a keeper, right? You can keep her. Or whether you tell her, you got to divorce her. Okay, so when are you going to tell her you got to divorce her? Chayve kritu, right? And yet they're both considered achotcha, moledet bayit, meaning she's a keeper, or moledet chutz, or she's from the outside, and you have to divorce her. Doesn't matter. Still your sister, even if she was born from this forbidden union. Well, now, obviously, the Gemara is going to ask the obvious question. We had this yesterday, right? So first, I need to read one more word, right? Va'amar rachmana achotchahi. That's the main point, right? And yet the pasuk says she's your sister. even though it was a marriage that you were supposed to divorce her. So now the Gemara says, wait a minute. If this is including more cases, even where you say to the father, divorce this woman, well then, theoretically, well, that was the same exact thing we said about the first one. We said the shifchani Ovedet Kochavim, can't stay married to her, so it's not a marriage. Why don't we say, even if it's not a marriage, that's moledech chutz, that should be included. And we excluded it from Eshet Avicha. So the Gemara says, Amar Kra, the answer which where we started. Bat Eshet Avicha, mi sheyesh lo ishut la'avicha ba. Prat l'chotom v'shipcha v'ovedek kochavim. In other words, the basic answer is, there's one pasuk that limits, there's one pasuk which includes. The limiting pasuk is limiting the shipcha v'ovedek kochavim, right? The maidservant and, right, the Canaanite maidservant and, which, or any non-Jewish, and the ovedek kochavim, the Gentile woman, or the, idol worshiper in the words of the Gemara, versus the pasuk that includes, and that includes any forbidden relatives that are even chayvei kritu. So now the obvious question is, umara'ita. Okay, we understand there's one pasuk limiting. There's one pasuk including. But why limit that and include that? Why not the reverse? Why don't we say it limits chayvei kritu and it includes shifchan ovedek kochavim, right? It sounds a little bit arbitrary. So the Gemara says, "Mistaber chayvei kritud havalei l'rabot, sheken tafse ben gidushin la'alma." If a man can't marry his daughter, while it's true, it's very severe. However, someone else in the Jewish community can marry his daughter, right? There's a bunch of people who can't because they're forbidden relatives. But beyond those X number of people, there's the rest of the whole Jewish community that can marry her. Whereas the shifchan ovedek kochavim can never be part of the Jewish community. So now, you'll tell me, unless they convert, we're going to get there. Okay, so therefore, if we're going to limit one and include the other, it makes sense to limit the one that basically can't marry any Jew rather than limit the one that can marry other people. To which the Gemara says, Adarabba, no, I'll give you the reverse claim. Shivcha v'ovedek kochavim havalei l'rabot. Di'i megaira l'didi nami tafse b'kiddushin. I'll give you better. The shivcha v'ovedek kochavim, and this is the question, should be included more because they theoretically can marry this person. We're talking about the marriage of this person. If they were to convert, they can marry this person. The answer to this question is obviously in yesterday's daf, which is l'chi megaira gufa achrinahi. When she converts, remember we said they're kikatan shenolad, right? They're like a newborn being, which means they're not exactly, and this again, like how you define this and how you explain this is a good question, but they're not exactly the same person they were before. They're reborn. They become some. So it's true, you can marry technically that person and to you they look the same and they might view themselves as the same, but halachically, it's like they're a new entity. That's why they don't have, their relatives are no longer connected to them and all these other things that I saw there was a lot of discussion about this in the WhatsApp groups and stuff about, is this a difficult thing? Is this a nice thing, right? On the one hand, this beautiful thing, right? This idea that you're born as new, right? I think a lot of converts even experience that, right? You're basically starting a new life. So there's something very beautiful about that. On the other hand, the fact that there's halachic ramifications to it that are difficult in terms of, do you sit shiva for your relatives? What do you do? And then it becomes a little bit difficult. But the concept is a very beautiful concept. You're basically coming into something new and you're starting from scratch. So now, in the end, right, that's not the topic of discussion for our daf, but the point here is it's not the same person really. This person is different at that point. So you can't say that. And that's why we're going to exclude a man who has a relationship with someone who's not Jewish. And we're going to include chayvei kritu, okay? Because she theoretically can marry other people in the Jewish community. Okay, that's the end of this small section of Rabbi Yossi. It wasn't a small section, but this one issue that we were dealing with Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, which is what does he do with bat eshet avicha? If he doesn't think it means extra set of lashes, then what's it there for? It's there to say you have to have ishut, which comes to basically exclude. It's not your sibling if your father has a child with a shipcha or ovedek kochavim. Now the Gemara says, wait a minute, what about the rabbis? Where do they get this from? They don't have bat eshet avicha, right? We're in this ping pong game now. Where do they learn this halacha from? They don't have bat eshet avicha because they need it for the lashes and the chatat, the sin offering. So where do they get it from? We saw that yesterday, that when an Eved Ivri goes into a house to work, to become a servant or a slave, he basically right? He gets to kind of marry while he's there, the Shifcha Knani. Now, I want to talk about Shifcha Knani for a minute. And this does sound a little bit strange, but you have to remember, Shifcha Knani is a unique status. It's not like anyone who might have slaves nowadays, right? Even though we don't really have slaves anymore, or servants or housekeepers, it's not the same thing. This is a situation in those days, people would come into their house and live there forever, basically. And they would, that part, maybe some people do still have, I don't know, but and in the dreadful places in the world where this exists, but this is what doesn't exist anymore. They become Jewish, so to speak. They're semi-Jewish. They basically accept upon themselves all mitzvot aseh, all mitzvot lo taseh, and all mitzvot aseh that are not time-bound. Okay, so they are like women in that sense. So the Shifcha is no different than a regular Jewish woman almost, because she basically accepts the Torah. If they're men, they get a Brit Milah even. Okay, they do circumcision. So they're somewhat Jewish. So while the servant is while the Eved Ivri, the Jewish slave, is in the house, he basically can have relations with her, have children with her, to provide him with kind of a family while he's there. But then when he leaves, the children stay, they don't go with him at all, which means that he's disconnected with them, which means his children are not his own children. That's a perfect proof for the Shifcha. Okay, so there you see it. They're not siblings with his other children because they stay in the house and they have nothing to do with him. Right? Maybe he goes and visits them, but right, we don't know that. We're not talking about, if he really cuts any relationship with him, but they're not really considered his children, which again is a very strange thing. But again, has to be understood in a historical context of a world that we don't really live in nowadays. So now the Gemara says, okay, so he learns it from there. So now what about Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda? That's a really good proof, to which they say, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, cha b'shifcha, cha b'oved kochavim. We're now going to correct, and I forgot to cross this out on the chart, but go back to Bad Eshet Avicha. It says on the side of Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, it says if you have Ishud, it comes to exclude achotom b'shifcha b'oved kochavim. Now we're going to cross out shifcha. It really just comes to include a non-Jewish woman. But his shifcha is learned out exactly like the rabbis do from Ishavi Yeladat Yeladoneh. Okay, but now, big question is, why do we need two different verses? They're basically non-Jewish women, right? Even though the shifcha is semi-Jewish, and maybe that's going to be part of the issue here. So why do we need both? Utsricha, you need both. Why? If you just had shifcha, what would you have said? Mishum de'en lachayis. The reason is shifcha. What's different from a shifcha and a Gentile? Well, a shifcha, generally avadim are considered not to have yichus. Okay, what that means exactly is a question. Some people say there's a pasuk that talks about the Eved of Avraham in the Akedah story, shvulach ha'po'am ha'chamor, that they're considered like property and like animals, and therefore they don't, right? We don't trace animals, yichus, we don't trace them. That's one way of looking at it. It's obviously a difficult way to view it, that we treat humans as animals, right? It's not really a place we like to go. Some people say that it's that their yichus is problematic, right? We never really know, first of all, especially here, we say she could have an Eved Ivri, children with him and children with him. Nobody tracks their yichus, right? They're not really connected. Also, even more so, they're not connected to the father, right? If they were to have children with this Eved Ivri, we don't have it go by the father. So that's what it means, there's no yichus. But Oved kochavim de'i lachayis emalo. But a Gentile woman does have yichus. Now, what does it mean to have yichus? So it means, right, we usually assume yichus means good, Jewish blood or something. What it means here is in the Torah, at least I saw an explanation that explains this way. In the Torah, there's a whole bunch of psukim that quote this Gentile, the son of his father, this Gentile, the son of his father, whereas the slaves don't go by their fathers, they go by the mothers only. But these people are sometimes listed with the genealogy of their parents, and therefore they must have some sort of yichus. So maybe you would think, if you just had the shifcha pasuk, you wouldn't be able to learn the Oved Kochavim. What about that though? And this is the obvious. Well, right? They're not even at all Jewish. At least the shifcha has mitzvot upon her. So if you excluded the Oved Kochavim, you wouldn't have necessarily known to exclude the shifcha, and therefore it's tzrich. Now what are we left with? Okay, in our ping pong, Rabbanan eshkachan shifcha Oved Kochavim minale. Well, the rabbis now only have Aisha Vadonet, right? Aisha v'yeladet Yeladoneh to prove the shifcha. Bat Eshet Avicha proved, according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, the Oved Kochavim is on the outs. But the rabbis don't have that verse. So where are they going to learn an Oved Kochavim from? We just proved, originally we thought they're going to learn it from Aisha v'yeladet Yeladoneh. And there I crossed it out, if you notice now, the Oved Kochavim, because they suggested it. But then they say, we just said, right? And we're going to say that right now. If you want to learn out from shifcha, We just said you can't learn it from a shivcha because they're not the same. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, and this is a very famous drasha here. This is going to be, right? So if you think we're learning things that aren't relevant, this is super relevant. This is where we learn that Jewish genealogy goes by the mother. Amar Kra, ki yasir et bincha me'achorai. This is the pasuk that says, don't marry people from other nations, don't marry off your daughters to their sons, and etc. And then it says, because he will turn away your son. Now, who's the he and who's the son? So first of all, it says he will turn away your son and not she. So from there, they learn that we're talking about, the concern is that if your daughter marries a Gentile man, he will turn away your son. Well, it's your daughter. So who's your son? Your grandson. Okay. The child born from that union who's still Jewish. Okay. If it had said kitasir, female, it would have meant the woman, the Gentile woman will turn away your son, meaning if your son marries a Gentile woman. But that's not what it says. So from there, they derive bincha mi-Yisraelit karoi bincha, right? Your grandson here, which was born to your daughter who's Jewish, is called your son. But we're not worried, ki asiret bincha, if the mother was Gentile, if your son married. Why? Because, but ein bincha haba min ovedet kochavim karoi bincha ele bina. It won't be your son. She won't be turning anyone away because the son is not Jewish. So that's not what the Torah is talking about, because the assumption is it all goes by the mother. Okay, that's what they're learning from here. And Amar Ravina, he says an added thing, which is Shma Mina, ben bitcha haba min ovedet kochavim karoi bincha. He says, you can see, because the bincha is your grandson. So your grandson that's born to your daughter who's Jewish, who married someone who's not Jewish, is still considered your son. Okay? That's just an added thing here. Lema kasava Ravina, is he trying to say, now, what does it mean it's your son? It sounds like Ravina is trying to say, and this goes back to the question of Mamzer, that your son is kosher because he's your son. Your son means your son from a kosher marriage. They assume it wouldn't be called your son if it's a Mamzer. So they're saying, Lema kasava Ravina ovei kochavim be'eved habab ovei kochavim be'eved habab ba'Yisrael havlad kasher. Are you saying that if a Gentile man or a slave sleeps with a Jewish woman, the vlad is kasher? It's perfectly good. It's your son, right? He's 100% Jewish. Your son, no problem. He has no problem with his genealogy. How could that be? So they say, well, nihi de mamzer lo have kasher nami lo have Yisrael pasul mikra. This is a very, very, very important line. Okay, what does it say here? Since he's not a mamzer, but he's also really not kasher. It's called your son, but he's pasul. Now, what does it mean he's pasul? So many people think it means he can't marry, she can't marry, if it's a female, a kohen. Okay, now, this is very relevant nowadays. It was very irrelevant until recently. Why was it very irrelevant? Because how often is it that you have a woman who marries a Gentile man, has a child, and they want to marry a Kohen, right? There's not a huge percentage of Kohanim. There's not a huge percentage of these situations. And also, many people who this might have happened with maybe weren't getting married in a Jewish court or anything. Now that, first of all, in Israel, you have to get married through the Rabbanut if you want to get married. There's, according to my husband who works at, who runs a team, where basically they deal with questions like this. He said there's 150, 125 cases, something like that, between 125 and 150 cases a year where this happens. It's incredibly common now. And he said that there's a very interesting psak halacha that in Israel they much more rely on than in Chutz La'aretz, possibly because it's just much more relevant here and they had to find a resolution, which is that this halacha, even though, again, this means that if a Kohen is married to, it can't marry someone whose father was non-Jewish. Okay, it's another psul kiuna, but there's a psak of the Sma, who's an Achron, who basically says, we permit it b'di eved, after the fact. Now, what does after the fact mean? After the fact could be after they're already married. After the fact could be if they're already living together or something like that. And based on that, there are situations where they permit this to happen. So it's important to understand this is a big issue nowadays, very big issue, particularly because there's a lot of people in Israel who are Jewish because their fathers are Jewish and not their mothers are Jewish and therefore not halachically Jewish. When they go to get married, they have an issue. Okay. So that's a little bit of, what goes on nowadays. So now the Gemara says, okay, so now we say is psul, but again, the question, and then besides that, psul, most people think it means psul the kiuna. Some people say it doesn't mean psul the kiuna. It's another reason to be mekel here. It just means they don't have great lineage, but they're not necessarily not able to marry a kohen. So now the Gemara says one last question. This whole pasuk of Lo Yasil is talking about Habeshiva Umot Ktiv. It's only talking about the 7 nations in the land of Israel. What about any other ones? So Ki Yasir L'Rabot Kol HaMesirim. They say the word Ki Yasil is anyone who might turn your child away, and that would include everybody. But in order to darshan that, one last question here before we get to the next Mishnah. In order to darshan that, we need to say that those words are unnecessary. Now, those words are only unnecessary if, because those words really tell you what the reason for the mitzvah is, so they're necessary. Well, it's a big debate between Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis. Are you allowed to darshan Talmud Dika? Can you try to come up with your own reasons as to why the psukim, why they give you a mitzvah? So according to Rabbi Shimon, you're allowed to darshan Talmud Dika. You can come up with reasons for the mitzvah, in which case, Lo Yasir is totally unnecessary. It's obvious, don't marry a Gentile because they might turn your child away. That's clear. So you don't even need a pasuk, which means it's unnecessary, which means you can darshan it. So therefore, Rabbi Shimon did darish Talmud Dika. It makes sense according to Rabbi Shimon. But where are the rabbis going to learn it from? And then we're back at square one. If the rabbis can't learn for all of Dei Kochavim from here, then where do we learn that a union of a person with an Ovedet Kochavim is not going to be considered your brother because they're not Jewish? If Ki Yasir is only related to the Sheva Umot, and you don't have Ki Yasir is giving you the reason for the pasuk, but it's not an unnecessary pasuk. So Man Tana did give a very interesting answer. We're trying to explain the Chachamim. We disagree with Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yudan. We can't explain them according to the rabbis in the debate between Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis. So what are we going to say? Those rabbis are Rabbi Shimon. So Man Tana de Palagalit Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yudan, Rabbi Shimon. In which case they hold like Rabbi Shimon, which means you don't need Ki Yasir, which means Ki Yasir can apply to everybody and not just the 7 nations that lived in the land of Israel before we conquered it. And therefore we resolve it. So again, Bat Esh Davicha, according to the rabbis, is coming to give an extra set of lashes or an extra sin offering. You're going to have to learn that there's no ishut, and the daughter of a union of a shivcha and Oved Kochavim is going to have to be learned somewhere else. The shivcha we learn from Yishav Yeladeh Tiyeh Ladoneha. That both of them learn from there, and the Ovedet Kochavim is learned from Ki Yasir, and according to Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda, it's learned from Bat Eshet Avicha, that there has to be ishut and not a Gentile woman. That resolves all those issues, and with that, we're going to move on to the next Mishnah. This next Mishnah is going to be a little bit confusing. I will bring up the sheets so that you can follow. Okay, here goes. Okay, Now we have a situation, okay? You have to remember how people betrothed women in those days. Often they sent messengers. So with that understanding, you can kind of imagine how this case would happen. He used to send messengers. She would send messengers. You can imagine a father sends a messenger for his daughter to be betrothed, and maybe the messenger gets confused which daughter, okay? Misha kidesh achat mishtei achayot. Someone betroths, okay, we know who the guy is, but we don't know which daughter he betrothed, okay? So the answer here, maybe the example should have been Yaakov, but it's Rachel and Leah get married to Reuven in this example. He betrothed one of them, and we don't know which one. So what does he have to do? Notain get lezeva, get lezo. Okay, there's 2 basic issues you need to know before we go on. One issue we've learned already, which is achot zekukato. Remember that? If 2 women fall to yibum to one person, okay, or in this case, it's going to be one. We don't know which one, but if, let's say it was Rachel, was the one who's supposed to do yibum, and he marries Leah, well, that's a problem because he's supposed to marry her sister. Remember the Zika, which means he's already connected to your sister. You can't marry 2 sisters. So basically, we're going to have a problem. So if you go back here, if he doesn't, right, if Reuven was to stay married, okay, well, the truth is I'm already jumping into Yibum, but when we get to Yibum, this is going to be the problem. At this point, I shouldn't even get there yet. But the point is right now, he can't, if he wants to stay married to one of them and not the other, he actually has a different problem. Before I get to that, sorry that I started with that by accident. But if he wants to stay married to Rachel and divorce Leah, what's the problem? Let's say he divorces Leah and stays married to Rachel. The problem is he maybe was married to Leah already. So, and I'm interchanging marriage and betrothal. It really doesn't matter for our intents and purposes. So it's just easier for me to say married. So I'm just going to use marriage, even though it's really just betrothal. But he can't be with Leah right now because maybe I'm sorry, I don't remember now which I said, but he can't be with one of them because maybe he already married the other one. And yes, he divorced her, but you're not allowed to be married to her 2 sisters, even when you divorce one and you marry the other. You can't unless one of them is dead. And here they're both alive. So that's why you have to divorce them both. Mate, what if he dies? Vilo ach echad, and he has a brother. So then, here we're going to get to our two issues I wanted to discuss before. One is achot zkukato. Let's say he's married to Rachel, and then he decides to do yibum to Leah, okay, because he doesn't know. So he thinks, okay, maybe I'm right. But what's the problem? If he first does yibum to Leah, it's a problem of achot zkukato. Rachel might be zakuk to him, right? She's supposed to do yibum with him, which means you're not allowed to marry her sister. Let's say he does chalitza first to Leah, and then he tries to do yibum to Rachel. That's another problem that we haven't seen yet. By the way, achot zkukato is only rabbinic. And the second one is achot chalutzato. Once he does chalitza to one sister, it's as if he was married to her. And we already said you can't marry a sister when the sister's still alive. So if he were to do chalitza to Leah and then marry Rachel, in the effect, either it'll be yibum, or if Leah was his yevamot, Leah's out of the picture and he can marry Rachel, it's just a regular marriage. The problem is he already did chalitza to her sister, in which case he's forever forbidden only on a rabbinic level to Rachel. Okay, so therefore, he has to do chalitza to both. Okay, that's his only option, chalitza to both women, because of number one, achot zkukato and achot chalutzato. Once he does chalitza, he can't marry the other one ever. Hayulo shnayim. What if he had two brothers? Now here, what's the benefit? You don't have achot chalutzato. Achot chalutzato is on the brother who does chalitza. So if Shimon does chalitza to one, then we get rid of achot zkukato because, okay, let's go on. If Reuven dies and Shimon does chalitza to Rachel, so Leah can do yibum with Levi, only in that order, okay? First, Shimon has to get rid of Rachel, has to do chalitza to Rachel, which gets rid of achot zkukato. Rachel, if she was the real wife, she's no longer connected to them anymore, in which case Levi's free to marry Leah. So Leah will do yibum with Levi. Either it's yibum or it's marriage, right? If Leah wasn't the wife, then it's just marriage, and that's totally fine. Kadmu v'kansu. What if they have two brothers, Reuven dies, and the two brothers jump right in and marry? They don't check the halacha. They don't know that one's supposed to do chalitza and the other's supposed to yibum, and they just go ahead and get married, which is, again, I wrote here, it's either yibum or marriage, right? We don't know which one, but right, one of them will be yibum, one of them will be marriage. Then, emotzi mi'adam, we leave it. Why? Because what's the only issue here? Achot zkukato, right? There's no achot chalutzato because no one was chalitzat. And there's two brothers, so we're not worried anyway. But we still have to worry, maybe one of them was connected, but at this point, they're both married. Once they're both married, any zika there was is disconnected off of them, is kind of severed. So at this point, they shouldn't have done this in the first place because the marriage itself could have been a problem. But once they're married, it's totally fine, okay? Because all of this is rabbinic anyway, so it's okay. Now here, the case gets a little more complicated, but you have to remember, everything is on the basis of the same concept, okay? This whole mission is going to be, it's basically building on with the same ideas. Shnayim shiketshu shtei achayot. We now have Nadav and Reuven, each betrothed one of these two women, and neither one knows which one, okay? I think the assumption is Reuven did one and Nadav did the other, but we don't know who did what, okay? Maybe a shaliach came to be for both of them and he didn't remember who was which, okay? So, right, the father sends the shaliach to get the betrothal for both of his daughters, and they didn't remember who was who. So, neither one knows which one he betrothed. So, what do we say? So again, same thing as the first time. Each one needs to give each one a get. So each wife gets 2 gitim, basically. What if each has a brother? So, just like before, we said because of achot chalutzato and achot zkukato, so each brother, right, has to do chalitza to both. No one can do yibum. So, ze choletz l'shtehen, v'ze choletz l'shtehen. So here, Shimon does chalitza to both, Avihu does chalitza to both. Now, lezeh echad u'lezeh shnayim. What if Reuven had one brother and Nadav had 2 brothers? You can see how they're getting into every possible permutation. So now, so Hayachid, Shimon comes in and does chalitza shishtehen. This actually should have been on separate slides because this happens first. First, Shimon has to come and do chalitza to both because both women are possibly married to somebody else, right? They're possibly married to, they were possibly Nadav's Yevamot or Reuven's Yevamot. We don't know which one. So first we have to get rid of the first one, and he's only one, so he can't do yibum to either one. And anyway, maybe they're married to the other one. So Shimon has to do chalitza to both. Once Shimon does chalitza to both, they're now free from Reuven. They can go marry anyone they want as far as he's concerned, but they still have to worry about Nadav because they're Yabam, maybe they're Yevamot to Nadav. So again, it's basically a case of one, right? Two women and two brothers. So one does chalitza, and then the second one, by the way, this yibum is he can if he wants to. Okay, so that's echad choletz ve'echad miyaben. The second one could do chalitza if he wanted to, but he could do yibum. Okay, in this case, only the last one could do yibum, as we said before, because already the chalitza got rid of the zika, the connection, and therefore he can go get married. Kadmu v'kinsu, what if Shimon did chalitza to both, and then these two brothers came along and both got married to one to Rachel, one to Leah. Again, this is the exact same thing as before. Since Shimon already got rid of the chalitza of Reuven, and we were only dealing with Nadav at this point, so each brother, what was done is done, and it's okay. So you don't have to get divorced. L'zeh shnayim u'l'zeh shnayim. Okay, last case. Reuven and Nadav, basically, I mean, it's not the last case, but there's three basically scenarios. So Reuven and Nadav both betrothed these women, and we don't know who, and they both died, but they each have two brothers in this case. So what happens? Now we get a little trickier. Shimon, okay, zeh choletz l'echad, achiv shel zeh choletz l'echad, achiv shel zeh choletz l'echad. One brother of Reuven does chalitza to one, and the brother of Nadav does chalitza to the other. So we take one brother does chalitza to one woman, and the other brother from the other family, the other man, does chalitza to the other woman. In which case, we basically, right, we've gotten rid of at least one for each man. How does that help us? Well, achiv shel zeh miyabem chalutzato shel zeh, v'achiv shel zeh miyabem chalutzato shel zeh. At this point, Levi can go marry Leah because Elazar's already done chalitza. So she's no longer connected to Nadav, which means that as far as Reuven is concerned, Shimon's already done chalitza to the other sister, so he's allowed to do yibum based on everything we learned before. And the same thing with the second woman, just flipped in terms of Reuven. Okay, so the second ones can do yibum. What if kadmu shnayim b'chaltzu? What if they went right ahead, the first two, and didn't do the way the law said, but the first two brothers of Reuven actually did chalitza first? So lo yibmu hashnayim, you can't have Elazar and Avihu do yibum, and this we know already because echad choletz ve'echad miyaben, because if they both did yibum, again, one would be doing yibum, one would be marrying someone who's connected to, possibly he's connected to the other sister, and that's a chotzku kato. So one does chalitza, and then the other one does yibum. Kadmu v'kinsu, but if in this case, they both did chalitza, Reuven's brothers, and then Nadav's brothers both married her without checking the law. Because again, it's just a problem of a chotzku kato, and at this point, she's not connected anymore, and therefore that's okay. Okay, so that's the end of a bit of a confusing Mishnah. Now the Gemara is actually way less confusing than the Mishnah. We're going to start with the first two sugyot, which are basically going to be inferences from the Mishnah. You can see from the chart on the page that we're going to do the exact same sugya twice, so it's going to be even simpler, because we're going to just do like a repeat based on the first section and then on the second section. There's basically three sections, but we're going to do the first and the second. I mean, there's two main scenarios. There's one brother, or there's one guy who does two women, or there's two people who do two women. But within that, there's one brother, or there's two brothers, right? Or two brothers to both. There's a bunch of scenarios. So Shema Mina, from the first line of the Mishnah, if you betroth two women, Ein Yodeh as a Mehen, he doesn't know which one, Notain get Lizo, get Lizo. That means, if you need a get, that means it was a valid kiddushin. Now, this therefore seems to infer something. Shema Mina, kiddushin shem esurin l'biyah havu kiddushin. It seems to infer that if you have a kiddushin, that you actually can't sleep with the woman. Why? If he's not sure which one he betrothed, then he can't sleep with any one of them because maybe he's actually married to his sister, to her sister. So therefore, it's not a kiddushin that he could ever consummate. So now, why do we care if it teaches us that? Well, this is one of the famous 6 machlokot that we hold like Abaye over Rava. Ya'al Kigam, the kuf that's the Rashi Tevot for the 6 cases. Kuf is kiddushin shalom surul l'biyah. Dafka Abaye says it is kiddushin, but the point is Abaye and Rava wouldn't have a big machloket on something that was very clear in the Mishnah. So it doesn't make sense. So they say, so let's understand this case a little differently than we've understood until now. When the shaliach married them, or when they got married, we don't know what, the betrothal was valid. We knew exactly who it was, but afterwards we got confused. Then the kiddushin itself was valid, but afterwards now comes the confusion. Also, you can infer that from the wording of the Mishnah. Eino yodea, v'lo katani ve'eino yadua. It says, and you don't know, not it's not known. It's not known would be a case where we didn't even know from the first place. So therefore, it seems like this is really what the Mishnah means. Umay kamashma. Well, if that's the case, what's Okay, so you need a get. Obviously, you need a get. If it's Kiddushin, then you need a get to get out of it because you obviously can't stay married because you can't sleep with one woman. Maybe you're married to her sister. So Seifa Itzricha, the reason why they said they get a get was really just to start building the case. They really wanted to get to the continuation, which is, and this is just review because this is what we learned already, if he dies and he has one brother, he has to do chalitza, but if he had two brothers, and specifically in that order, first you have to do chalitza, then yibum. The first brother can't do yibum right away because he might be connected with zika to the sister. We do the exact same thing, and we'll finish there with the second part. Again, give them each a get. Doesn't that seem to imply kiddushin shema mina? You can infer from here kiddushin she'emasur lebiyah have a kiddushin. To which the Gemara says, "Hachanami keshehu kru levasaf nitarvu." No, the kiddushin was valid. You knew who it was. Just we lost track after. Sounds like that kid with the two kids in Shlomo HaMelech, right? They're not sure whose kid it is. Again, same exact thing. You can infer this from the language of the Mishnah because it says you don't know and not it's not known. And again, then what's it teaching us if it's obvious? So they wanted it for the continuation. Meitu and if one had one brother and one had two brothers. To which the Gemara said, right, they brought it for the continuation, but pshita, hainu that continuation, we could already, remember I told you, once you get the first case, you basically know all the other cases. So it's really unnecessary. So here they say, well, ma'u detema ligzor trei atuchad. You might have made a gzera in a case where there's two brothers to treat it like there's one brother, meaning achok chalutzato would be a problem, even though you didn't do chalitza, but maybe we make it more severe so that you don't get confused. And then they say, kamashman, that's why they need to teach you that case, that we don't make a gzera on two brothers. We allow the second one to do yibum, even though with one brother, they have to do chalitza, because he can't marry someone he did chalitza to. Therefore, it comes that we need that section. Vidafka, and then they just point out, which we already know, specifically you have to do chalitza, the had or yibume, but yibume bereish shalo, you can't do yibum first when there's two of them because the kapaga b'yivama b'shuk. If the first, right, if the woman's not taking care of chalitza from the first husband, the first potential husband, then she might be actually still has to do yibum with him. And then you're marrying a woman who has to do yibum, and we're not allowed to have her do that until she does yibum. So that's why you have to wait till the woman's got chalitza from the first husband, and only after that can you do yibum for her. And obviously you have to wait till your other brother did chalitza with the other one so that you don't have to worry about a chotz kukato. That was just a bit of a review of those cases. You can go through this again if I went through it a little too quickly. Have a great day, everybody. It actually sounds more confusing than it is. It's actually not so complicated. I mean, it might be complicated to get, but once you get it, it's pretty clear. And then it repeats itself a bunch of times. Just have to remember achot kukato and achot chalutzato. And also you have to remember that, maybe they're married, then you're with a married woman, right? And that's a problem. Or maybe they haven't done yibum yet and you have to get it right. You have to deal with one husband before you can deal with the second one, before any marriage can take place, to make sure you did chalitza and she's free from the yibum of the other person. With that, we'll finish for today. Have a great day.